Sony gets a ton of hype for their cameras in the wildlife photography industry. It had been a while since I had gotten my hands on a flagship Sony camera, so I wanted to try it out and see if Sony's current flagship, the Sony A1, really holds up to the hype. Coming over from Panasonic, I had a lot of high expectations, particularly with the autofocus. While most of these expectations held up, some definitely weren't quite as marvelous as I had hoped. A huge thanks to Sony for sending over the Sony A1 and the Sony 200 to 600mm for review and to test out, with the help of Hunt's Photo and Video. Hunt's Photo and Video is a fantastic camera shop located in the US where customer service is their first priority. If you're considering purchasing any wildlife photography gear, I'd highly recommend giving them a try and reaching out to my personal representative below, Noah Buchanan. Now, I've had the opportunity of using the Sony A1 exclusively for a few trips now out doing wildlife photography. And during these times out, I really made sure to use it exclusively handheld so I could really get a sense for the image stabilization in multiple scenarios. As well as I made sure to use it almost exclusively with autofocus so I could really get a good understanding for its autofocus capabilities in multiple different situations. Now, the AF is hyped up a lot by Sony, and this is where I was the most disappointed, but more on that later. In regards to the image stabilization, I was very content with the results. I tried out quite a few different scenarios, and in every scenario, I saw some of the best results I've ever seen with image stabilization between the Sony A1 and the Sony 200 to 600 combo. Combined between the body and lens, I was achieving around 7.5 to 8.5 stops of image stabilization, depending on the modes, and it allowed for me to feel very comfortable handheld. In 2 days, I'll be releasing a wildlife photography adventure out in the field in which I'm using the Sony A1 throughout my whole experience. During part of that morning, there were some gusts that really picked up and were providing a strong 20-mile-per-hour wind. Even in those conditions, while not perfect, I was able to get some relatively stable shots handheld, even with the wind blowing my lens all around, thanks to the amazing image stabilization. Now, let's talk about some technicals. The Sony A1 has a 50 megapixel sensor, which in my opinion is a very healthy amount for wildlife photography, and there isn't much more needed for anything better. Something I was impressed particularly by was with the buffer speeds on the Sony A1 that are just insane. You would think that when you're shooting at 30 frames per second mechanical shutter, you would get quite a bit of delay and lag when writing to the memory cards, but this was not the case whatsoever. The data always wrote itself super quickly, and I never found myself standing around to wait, even after taking 100 shots in a row on burst. Speaking of that burst, listen to the sound of this 30 frames per second burst mode. It's pretty incredible. The low light capabilities of this camera are phenomenal as well, and in low light it destroys other high megapixel cameras with its dual native ISO and typical Sony sensor quality in low noise. Overall, with dual recording, high resolution, noise control, and burst rates as some of best in its class in wildlife photography, this camera doesn't live down the name of flagship in any aspect of image quality. For those who record video, you'll be pleased to hear that as far as I'm concerned, this camera has the best specs for recording available on the mirrorless market. It can record 10-bit 4K 120p, which sits alongside any other flagship available. The rolling shutter and other aspects of video recording were great as well, with one exception. I am disappointed about the autofocus in video modes. In recording video, you can't use bird detection autofocus, meaning that you'll have to resort to some other method of autofocus during filming. While these weren't horrible, they definitely weren't ideal, as they were a lot harder to manage, especially with my shooting style. I like to shoot using foreground as often as possible or by adding in other scenic elements, and these would often confuse the autofocus during recording video, resulting in what seemed to be about 40% accuracy in autofocus while recording video. So I'd rather just stick to manual. But most of you will be using autofocus just for photos if you're a wildlife photographer. And to this I say, manage your expectations. So the last Sony camera body that I had the opportunity to test out before this was a Sony A7 II. At the time, the Sony autofocus was still acclaimed to be best in autofocus, But it's also said to have come a lot much further since then. While yes, the Sony A1 is miles better than that camera, it still failed to live up to the hype that I had been presented with. If you've been following me for a while, you'll know that I shoot almost exclusively with manual focus for wildlife photography, and for good reason. For me, it eliminates the reliance upon a faulty AF system, and I know that if you give me just a single second, I can always tack focus correctly on the bird. With action shots, manual focus becomes a lot more difficult, but I still have learned some key ways around that, in which I'd encourage you to learn from some other videos on my main channel. So with the most recent Sony cameras, including this A1, they were made out to be nearly perfect in some situations. Yes, like the autofocus was absolutely mind-blowing as I was using it, but there were other situations that caused some severe problems. Let's start with the amazing. If you're subscribed to the channel, in this weekend's video, you'll see more, but there were some amazing encounters I had with mountain bluebirds up on the top of a mountain. During this time, I had the ability to test out a plethora of in-flight shots, and there were some specific moments in which the Sony A1 nailed focus absolutely perfectly on fast-moving subjects. One example of this was this moment here in which the bluebird flew directly at the camera with a simple sky background. Even though the subject was moving incredibly fast head-on towards the camera, it perfectly tacked focus with every single shot. Other times, when subjects were very prominent as well, the autofocus snapped incredibly fast into place and did a great job. However, for as many times as this happened, I had to struggle just about as many times with the autofocus. For example, in the majority of shots in which I wished to include foreground, it was a gnarly battle between the autofocus trying to pull focus on the foreground or the subject behind it. One of my evenings testing out this camera at a local park, the concrete bordering of the pond was causing problems all day long and kept the autofocus away from the subject. In scenes which the subject was not very prominent in its pattern, like these horned lark here, the autofocus had a lot of difficulty finding the subject and staying focused on it as well. So ultimately, I learned this. In the right scenarios, and namely when the subject is prominent and contrasted against the surroundings in regards to color or exposure, Sony's autofocus was absolutely pin sharp and responsive, and quite amazing. But in scenes that involved other objects in the same focal plane of the field, such as detailed plants, or especially in scenes that involved foreground elements, I'd have to spend much more time correcting the autofocus into the right area than I would have spent just manually focusing myself. Overall, if I had to give it a score, I'd say that I was able to tack about 70% of my shots with autofocus while doing bird photography. Am I being a little harsh? Well, maybe yes. 70% is undoubtedly the best autofocus I've tested in wildlife photography. However, with it being hyped up so much, I was personally disappointed, and reminds me of why personally I'll still be sticking to my manual focus techniques most of the time and relying on those. One more thing I'm still not a fan of with Sony is the way that their camera ergonomics and build is. Not only is the grip weaker than Panasonic, Canon, and Nikon cameras that I play with and try out, but their buttons are all so cramped and hard to find and press. For example, these buttons on top of the dials used to switch from, let's say, manual photo to creative video modes require you to push a lock button down and then turn the knob. But when I have gloves on, because it's really cold outside on a day like today, it's really difficult to push down the buttons and then fit my finger around the tiny knob without accidentally bumping other buttons. Even without gloves, I found this somewhat difficult. Sometimes I'd be shooting, then discover a few minutes later that I had accidentally bumped and changed some settings, and therefore it had messed up my shots. I also was a little dissatisfied with the viewfinder quality. You would think for a flagship camera worth $6.5K that the viewfinder would be absolutely phenomenal, but I definitely feel like I've used better. The display is supposed to be some of the most high resolution out there, so I can't say that this was the problem. Just for some reason, it looked very grainy and overly sharpened, which distracted me quite often from the scene that I was seeing out in nature. On the contrary, something that has drastically improved with Sony from the old days is their color science. Man, I remember back with the original Sony A7s how brutal it was trying to color those in post-production. Now, the colors are extremely accurate and known to be some of the best in the field, and from a personal stylistic standpoint, I don't disagree with how they process color either. The Sony A1 is undoubtedly the best camera I've tested, but I think wildlife cameras still have a way to go before I can really say that one completely fills my needs. With any current camera model, including the Sony A1, I'm still a bit underwhelmed with autofocus, but in almost every other significant way, I think this camera is almost exactly what I need. With the exception of their weird ergonomics, the burst rate is better than required, the video recording modes are phenomenal, the image stabilization is great, and all in all, it's mostly an amazing camera. If you're looking to purchase one, I'd encourage you to reach out to my personal representative at Hunt's Photo and Video from the description below. And in 2 days from now, I'll be releasing a wildlife photography adventure I had out with the Sony A1 and the Sony 200-600, which I'll be releasing a review on in the future as well. So make sure you subscribe to the channel for that. I'm sure that it will give you a lot more insight into the practicalities of the A1 and how it performs out in the field. Thanks for watching. And if you want to see a review I made on the brand new Sigma 60-600mm for E-mount that came out 3 weeks ago, check out this video here in the end screen.